and how the world right now is doing. I mean, are there any signs that you have picked out where the global economy is starting to really decline?
Well, where do I begin?
Yeah.
So what I've noticed, I'd first and foremost like to mention that you've probably seen the charts yourself, and I'm sure many of the viewers have. What we will find is that the U.S. stock markets and the Fed's balance sheet are in direct correlation. And these charts have shown this, that as soon as QE3 stopped, you had basically a stopping or a volatility within a range, but of the stock market, Fed balance sheet, all in line there. As soon as they began printing money for QE3, for example, the stock market rose. So it's all in direct correlation. So we know that if we want the stock market to go up or predict it to go up, then we would have to have a next round of quantitative easing. At the same time, you have record amounts of stock buybacks that are occurring. You also have incentive plans. This is hidden information for some reason, even though it is public, that there are incentives for other central banks to purchase shares in the US. And if there's incentives, obviously that with lowering of the interest rates that we've been seeing, people or investors or corporations or central banks, they're looking for deals. They're looking for profit, even if it's a minuscule amount of profit. So they go into what they feel is safe. And if the US is giving them a deal, well, perhaps they'll go that route. So, that's one of the things I'd like to mention. We also see the slowdown within China that's beginning to frighten a lot of people. But there are those on the other end of the spectrum who will say, look, it's still growing. Don't hate on China, but that's definitely not the case. What I do see, though, is a globalized world. You can't have a strong China on its own. You can't have a strong US on its own anymore. It's a globalization. All nations are interconnected in one degree or another. And as I always say, all of the dominoes will fall.
So what you're seeing right now is that all these economies are interconnected, and even though the U.S., where they're continually saying that the U.S. is doing fine, we're in a recovery. Today they announced that unemployment is at 5%. They lowered it once again. That we just can't have one strong country and the rest failing. It just doesn't work. That actually, it can't work that way, and it doesn't make any sense.
The unemployment rate is a complete joke. For me, it's a little bit of comic relief, at least throughout the day when you could read these type of statistics. Every time I happen to be passing by a television and it's, CNN or what have you, reporting on the different numbers, let's say the unemployment rate, what they're trying to tell us is that unemployment, or I should say that we are at full employment at this time. If anyone believes that we are at full employment at this time, then it is a complete joke, and you really, really have to sit down and look at this. Look at the actual civilian labor force participation rate. That shows you that we are near 4 decades low in the actual amount of employed people within the United States. That's the real unemployment figure that we should be looking at. Civilian labor force participation rate. You can just go to your search engine and look that up for the truth. The statistics are a complete lie, almost every single one. There are some that are more accurate than others, and of course we can look at websites like shadowstats.com or others that would tell us the bigger picture here. But ultimately, when they bring out facts and figures, we have to believe that in most cases, they are manipulated to some degree.
So right now, what do you think the unemployment rate is at this point?
Many do indicate it's over 20%. And the challenge with the actual unemployment rate is, how do you consider someone unemployed? Is underemployed necessarily unemployed, or is it, it depends on how you want to factor it. But we know specifically it's nowhere near 5%. It's at least 10%. Even using the U6 number, you get a number that's around that anyway. So let's even use their own fake government numbers, use the U6 number, which I haven't checked right now, but let's just make something up and say 10%. then that's a disaster, right? That's the kind of numbers that we were seeing during the height of the financial crisis and needs to be addressed immediately. What we need to do is exactly what they did in 1920 to solve this issue, and that is to cut federal spending dramatically. But that's a whole other can of worms.
Yeah, I don't see them cutting anything right now. I don't think they have the ability to do it at this point because they need everything running, everyone happy. And at this point, I don't think they're going to, at the end here, all of a sudden say, you know what, let's just cut everything and stop all this. They're just going to continue on and actually increase in what they're doing.
That's right. Obama's now, I'm sure you saw the $20 trillion man,
Hmm.
that the debt will expand beyond 20 trillion. And of course, raising the debt ceiling does not increase the debt, but we'll see how that goes. But all I want to say is that they're not going to decrease federal spending. They never will. And they always talk about, the conservatives always talk about cuts, but really they're actually just saying, instead of spending 2 trillion, we'll spend 1.9 trillion, vote for us instead. It's really a game that's been played for most people, and most people do believe it because they're not paying attention.
It's funny because how can you believe it? Because over time, all we've seen is the debt continually rise and expenditures continually rise, and none of it's true. But go ahead, sorry.
I was just going to say that as long as you have the spokesman up there, the Emperor Obama, as long as he said, look, Congress, you got to pay your bills, then people believe that it's Congress's fault, not Obama's fault, and just sort of pointing the fingers in everyone's direction why this is the case. But people are so fooled by everything.
So if the economy is doing so well, we're at 5% unemployment, and they're telling us that retail is going to be fine, GDP looks good, inflation's very low. Why is the Fed hinting now about negative interest rates? Why are they doing this? If it's already at zero, wouldn't you think they would raise interest rates if everything is fine? Why are they talking about negative interest rates?
Negative interest rates are interesting. I do believe that it's a little game of cat and mouse to see. They put out certain words. Their vocabulary they use in these meetings, which they know becomes public, they often use particular verbiage in order to see how the market reacts to it. This is not a factor that is addressed by the mainstream financial media, but it's something that I've been looking at for years. Literally using a different word, saying maybe, saying possibly, saying, different degrees of a type of word affects the market the next day, and they'll quote that same thing for all that next time until that next meeting we have. What I find often is that it doesn't even matter their actions anymore. It's just their words. They've been talking about raising the interest rates now for so long. It hasn't happened. I've never seen it happen for so many years, and it doesn't look like it's going to be changing anytime soon. If they do bring it into negative, this is going to be following along with what we've seen Denmark and Switzerland and others going into the negatives. So they'll be following along in this regard. I don't know which direction they'll take in terms of negative interest rates. If they want to keep the system going, they do need to go negative. That's a fact. But I don't know if now's the best time to bring this up, but my gut feeling here is that there is an intention to crash the system, because this is when the richest of the rich, the super elites, technocratic elite, can do the most damage to us. They can get assets for pennies on the dollar. They can also exact control over the populace. They've done this countless times before. When the people are at their most weak, they are willing to accept certain lower standards of living. They've gotten away with this many times before. Look at how they passed the Patriot Act after 9/11, the Anti-Terrorism Act after Oklahoma City. And you could see this taking place historically. I believe it will happen again. They need to create a new monetary system, and they need a crash in order to bring that in. They need a very, very deep and gripping crash. We are overdue for a new monetary system. It's been over 40 years, and so we just have to anticipate it.
Well, let me just clarify something. Now, do you think you mentioned crash and they're going to purposely do this? Are you saying they're going to do this before they do negative interest rates, or they're going to do negative interest rates to bring on the crash?
What I believe will happen is that we will experience a real level of deflation. So the Federal Reserve will go in and perhaps address this um, by basically by printing money, by lowering the interest rates, but it's not going to do anything. So they'll have to hyperinflate the currency supply. In this hyperinflation, they exactly know what will happen. They can destroy the currency like this within a very short period of time. Oftentimes, historically, we've seen it as quick as a year.
Hmm.
In doing so, before the currency is completely eviscerated, all of the groups gather together, the G20, the IMF, the UN, the World Bank, everyone gathers together and they say, look, we need to come up with a solution. Of course, the highest of the high level individuals already have that solution provided. That is a new monetary system. What comes out of that new monetary system, I don't know exactly how it's going to look. We're not going to use new bills. I don't believe that's the way it's going to go. We'll use our current money that we're using now because the people won't know any different. But what backs it, what goes behind it, all the decisions, the unelected technocrats that sit behind the stage, they are the ones who are going to have more control over the system. And I believe that ultimately the average person won't know a thing different, but they're going to be at a lower standard of living.
So to pull this off, I mean, right now, the Obama administration, the Fed, they're continually telling us that the economy is doing better, we're in recovery, and just as we just mentioned, the unemployment came down. How are they going to pull this off? Like, how are they going to crash the system if all these years they've been telling us we've been in a recovery? I mean, won't this look bad for them?
It will. I believe that for some people, they'll lose their credibility, even during the financial crisis when all of their friends were getting all the bailouts. Somewhat, they did lose some of their integrity, let's say. But ultimately, I don't think people are paying enough attention. They're too focused on their reality TV shows and all of the silliness that's around. And ultimately, they won't really be paying attention. It's sad to think about. I've actuaried this out many times before. Ultimately, the people will accept whatever they're given. This is the bread and circus that we've been seeing. It's not just during the Roman times. We've been seeing that ever since. As long as the government could provide welfare, some sort of social assistance programs for the people will be okay. That's just the way it works. More and more people are going on the food stamp program. You have tens of millions on the disabilities. You have unemployment insurance being a factor. You have unfunded liabilities that some calculate well over $100 trillion, but depending on the calculation you want to use, even if you use a more conservative number, it doesn't matter. It can't all be paid back. They have to crash the system. In that, some people believe a debt jubilee will occur. I don't believe the average person will get any break at all. It will be the big corporations that get a break, if anything. But I believe they're just going to go ahead with it, but it's going to be slow. It's not going to be overnight necessarily that things are going to take place. People believe, they were calling for a September crash. They were calling for an October crash. Here we are in November. The system's still here. I do believe that they do about this very slowly and methodically, and it's been a plan for, forever, essentially.
So for the everyday person, what are they going to experience? Because let's say I'm working, I have, savings. I have, I don't know, 30,000, 40,000, if even have that in the bank. I have my retirement and I'm working at a job. When they start to bring this system down, what happens to your home, your funds in the bank, your retirement, and everything else? What happens to that? What are people going to see from that?
What I suspect the most likely scenario, and this is not the guaranteed, of course, but the most likely scenario, I believe that anything paper related or connected into the paper markets could be confiscated in such a way where you have, whether it's, let's say, massive inflation that in a way wipes you out, and deflation could wipe you out. And I know that's a little confusing there, but I explained that on my YouTube channel. But anyway, you could get wiped out in that regard. You could have massive taxation that occurs, but ultimately what we will see is the bail-in strategy. The bail-in strategy has been implemented in Cyprus. All of the G20 nations, they met in Brisbane, Australia, to discuss implementing this in their respective countries. They want to do a bail-in everywhere because it's more political than taking it from taxation. So they take it directly from the depositors' banks. They can do this in stages where they take the richest of the rich and they take money from them, and the public will chant and cheer for that. But they say, you know what, we took 50% from them, but for you, the middle class, we only have to take 10%, let's say. And the people will say, well, you know what, that's fine. If I have to pay 10%, well, you know, they have to pay 50, so I'm fine with that. But another round will come and they will have to get another 10%, and then 5% and 10% and 20%. And pretty much we're left with nothing. And this is the way that they will do this because it's the next available scheme. They can go negative interest rates, which I do suppose that many will, unless they're going about it a different route. There's many options for them, and not all central banks will necessarily react exactly how the Federal Reserve does, although they tend to follow suit. But I believe that the bail-in strategy will be the worst thing, and that means that all of your pension funds, your RRSPs or 401ks, superannuation, all of these are all interconnected with that, and they are all potentially a victim of this.
Do you see any black swans or anything that could disrupt their plan lurking in the far reaches of the world right now? Because I know they have their plan, but something always seems to come up where all of a sudden their plan is kind of flushed down the toilet and it just comes out of nowhere. I mean, if we go back to 2008, some of the US government was notified ahead of time that the market was coming down. So do you think there's anything out there that can bring this down without them doing a methodical crash, like you said?
Well, I do believe that the high frequency trading will be a factor in this, because I don't even know if they have full control over that. So I do believe that's something we need to keep our eye on. If you look at some of these stock charts and they show you like second by second basis, you can see within a few seconds the markets go ballistic in extreme volatility that would never be possible with human interaction. So this right here makes it possible to go in any direction, and I'm really not sure how it's going to react. They may program it in a certain way, but that triggers other algorithms which mess that up. So high frequency trading is definitely one that I would say that is a huge concern of mine.
What about the conflict out in the Middle East and around China, which might lead to war? Do you think that will have any type of an effect
It could
on?
certainly, yes, it could certainly have some effect. You know, a few years ago, they suggested that they wanted to go into Syria to topple the Assad regime. He was a bad guy. They were making him out to be Gaddafi. Gaddafi, they made out to be another Saddam. And they said, look, we got to take him out. So that didn't go over well politically, and they backed off. So then they brought ISIS in there as their rebel army, and they're trying to topple the Assad regime this way. And again, it's not really working, partly because of what Russia is doing and other reasons for that. So they have to get the public's acceptance in order to engage in any war. That's the way it is, whether it's a Pearl Harbor type event where they need to say, look, okay, this is it. This is our moment to go in. We were not taking it. And I don't know if they're able to control ISIS in the way that they want to, in a grand way. Something that we need to look at. I do believe also that China is an issue too, because they're always arguing over the South China Sea and everything that's going on in that vicinity, and you have all these warships heading into the different areas. But you know, we do see cooler heads prevailing here, and we'll have to really gauge it. I do believe that we could have some major activity occurring within Syria, because you have Russia there who is invited, and then you have the US there that is not invited. They say they're bringing ground troops in, and what I have read from the Russian side is that any activity from the US, whether it's from the ground, from the air, is illegal. So right there, that's a provocation of war and could ultimately lead to something. I hope not. I hope that it will be resolved at least, but ultimately, I'm not sure what to expect.
So, with your elections in Canada, is your government right now pulling out troops from Syria?
I don't even really factor in whether they say they will or not, because ultimately you have military contractors. So the military contractors are the ones that will remain there forever. They're not going to ever pull out. That's just the way it is. It's just like when Obama claimed that he pulled all the troops out, never did. They left military contractors there, tens of thousands, and that's the way they can get around this. You hear a lot of claims from the Canadian elections that took place, and
Hmm.
they are all one party, just like it is in the US. They have slight differences, but ultimately the war machine will always win. The military industrial complex will have control over them, and they will continue to fight. It's pretty funny because Canada often is seen as peacekeepers, but
Right.
that image has really changed in recent years. In fact, they were one of the first countries to bomb Libya. So they're in there, and they will be, in fact, helping with NATO and with all of the bombing of innocent civilians, as well as their own armies of ISIS and others.
So, what is your time frame where this entire system starts to fall apart? I mean, how you're saying it's going to be a long period of time. How long do you think it will be until the system actually falls apart and just crashes?
One of that's one of the challenges that I face all the time
Mm.
because I often have subscribers and emails and everything coming at me asking, when do you think this is going to happen? I do believe that at a certain point there will be a trigger and things begin to rapidly decline. That trigger point could be any number of things, what Nassim Taleb refers to as the black swan event. Um, there are certain things that could take place. If derivatives, for example, fall apart, it will happen very rapidly. It will happen extremely rapidly. Obviously, anything that goes bigger than the GDP of the entire world, you have various banking institutions that have more derivatives than the GDP of the entire world, whether it's JP Morgan or what have you, that could crash the entire system very rapidly. They can't bail it out. It's impossible. So something like that, it could happen really fast. But ultimately, what would trigger that? There are many issues that we need to actuary out and figure out. I would say that ultimately it's just going to be a slow decay. The unemployment will continue to increase despite what the government really has projected to us, unless we see some sort of physical hot war taking place between major world powers. I believe that will obviously just continue this slow decline in death. Look at Europe. It's absolutely dying. It's really sad to see these historic nations having to sell off all of their assets. And I believe this is the strategy. They're trying to sell off every nation, sell off their assets to private corporations or the richest of the rich individuals. Look at Greece having to sell off some of their public institutions, having to sell off islands, getting rid of these major assets that are so historic, so important, and this is going to go on all around the world. You may have, for example, Italy, desperately in debt. They have their historic buildings like the Colosseum, which they want to do upgrades, they want to fix it up, but they don't have the funding to do so. Well, all you have to do is sell it off to a private corporation and they'll take over and they'll restore it. This is what I see happening, not necessarily to the Colosseum, I just use that as an example, but I do believe that that will happen. So ultimately, you'll have big corporations, technocratic elite, unelected bureaucrats running the system entirely, and it's going to happen. And generation through generation, people will become more accustomed to it, and they will be unable to identify the previous system.
Well, David, thank you for coming on the X22 Report Spotlight. I really do appreciate it. Thank you for coming back on.
Thank you very much for having me on. If anyone wants to check me out, of course, I have very similar topics to what they talk about here at X22. And often I do hear a lot from my subscribers that It's your channel and my channel that are their favorites. So I do appreciate all those fellow subscribers. So hope to see you there as well.